Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, get ready to plunge into some really influential and, let's be frank, pretty controversial ideas.
Definitely. Ideas that really shaped how we think about the mind.
Especially around gender, sexuality, and that whole hidden world of the unconscious. We're going deep into early psychoanalysis today.
Sigmund Freud, mainly.
Yeah, primarily Freud. Looking at how his ideas started, how they got changed over time.
And maybe what they can still tell us today, perhaps.
Exactly. It's complex stuff. And these ideas, they really shook things up back then, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Went against pretty much everything people thought they knew about themselves, society.
Yeah.
Sparked debates that are, well, still going on.
For sure. And to help us navigate all this, we've got quite a stack of sources here.
A varied mix.
Yeah. We've got bits from a paper on Jean Laplanche, who came later, parts of Freud's own famous Dora case study.
That's a classic.
Analysis comparing Freud and Jung on gender. Critiques from the British Psychological Society. A little look at the yoni symbol in feminist thought, and even like a snippet from Reddit showing these debates are still alive online.
So it's a real range. We get to see these ideas from lots of angles.
Origins, evolution, impact. The whole picture.
Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive, crack open this stack, pull out the key insights, and help you, our listener, sort of make sense of it all.
The history, the critiques, why it might still matter.
Exactly. Let's unpack this.
Okay. Where do we start? Maybe Freud's very first ideas about sexuality.
Good place. Even before psychoanalysis was fully formed, he had this really radical thought.
That sexual life doesn't just switch on at puberty.
Right. He thought it starts way, way earlier, infancy even.
And pleasure wasn't just about making babies.
Not at all. And this became like a cornerstone for him, didn't it?
Absolutely. He quickly connected this early pervasive sexuality to psychoneuroses.
Which were sort of older terms for conditions like hysteria, right? Physical symptoms without a clear physical cause.
Exactly. And he believed understanding sexuality was the absolute key to unlocking those conditions.
So he lays this all out in his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, 1905.
That's the one. And he describes sexuality not as this neat, tidy thing, but almost chaotic.
Yeah, indifferent to society's rules, even to the person's own good sometimes.
Right. Its basic goal, he thought, was just relieving tension from these erogenous spheres.
Basically pleasure zones on the body.
And locating this drive inside the body, this endogenous genesis, the idea comes from within. It was a massive shift, wasn't it?
Huge, especially after he ditched his earlier seduction theory. That was around 1897.
Pivotal moment, yeah. The seduction theory had blamed actual childhood sexual abuse by adults for causing neuroses like hysteria.
But he changed his mind.
He did. He started finding it implausible. Partly, he said, because neurosis seemed so widespread.
Too common to all be caused by actual abuse.
That seems to be part of his reasoning. He felt the cause had to be more fundamental, more internal, not just dependent on external events.
So he went from blaming the adult outside to locating the source of the trouble sort of within the child's own bodily drives.
That's the shift. And he felt the evidence supported this, especially his analysis of children and also people whose sexuality didn't fit the norm, what they called perverts back then.
What did that evidence show him?
Well, he felt it contradicted any simple, like, romantic and conflict-free picture of sexuality. It showed him just how complex and, frankly, weird the sexual drive could be right from the start.
Okay. Now, one of our sources, the one looking at Jean Laplanche, it suggests this move, locating the drive biologically inside, that had downstream consequences for psychoanalysis itself.
Yeah, Laplanche's take was interesting. He worried that by making the drive's origin too neatly biological, too endogenous, psychoanalysis might end up trying to explain everything with that one key.
Like reducing it all down to biology.
Kind of. Laplanche felt it risked turning the sexual drive into just another biological instinct, maybe losing Freud's original, really radical insight that the sexual unconscious is fundamentally alien, disruptive.
Not just something serving, like, adaptive goals.
Exactly. It risked making psychoanalysis less about encountering this strange other within us and more just about explaining behavior patterns.
Ah, I see. Like making it too tidy, maybe losing some of the unsettling power.
That's one way to put it.
Right.
And the Dora case study, written in 1901, published in 1905, That's really where we see him trying to demonstrate these new ideas in action.
Right, showing how his theories on dreams and the psychosexual roots of neurosis actually played out in a real person with hysteria.
It was meant to be a kind of proof of concept.
Okay, so that's the Freudian foundation. Powerful, unsettling, very focused on that internal drive. But ideas don't stand still.
Never.
Let's talk about how psychoanalytic thought started to evolve. Where did the first big departures happen, especially around gender and sexuality?
Well, it spread fast, but the sources suggest that changes within the field regarding gender and sex were actually kind of slow sometimes.
Freud's core ideas held strong for a while.
For a long time, yeah. But a major split started to emerge, particularly with English-speaking analysts.
How so?
They began shifting away from Freud's intense focus on those internal biological drives.
And towards what?
Towards the importance of human relationships.
Ah, okay. So who are the main players there?
Well, in the U.S., you got ego psychology, people like Heinz Hartmann.
Right.
They built on Freud's later work, but really zeroed in on the ego's relationship with the outside world, reality.
So more about coping and adapting.
Exactly. Adaptation was key. How the ego helps you navigate life. They were also more into, empirical proof.
And what about the drives, the sexual drive?
They saw drives as becoming neutralized, basically tamed and put to work for the ego's adaptive goals. Less wild, more functional.
So a shift from the deep, messy inner world towards how the self functions out there.
That's a good way to think about it. A different focus. Meanwhile, over in Britain, you had Melanie Klein and the Independent Group.
Object relations.
That's them, British object relations. Their focus was super intense on the very first relationship.
Infant and mother.
Exactly. Concepts like projective identification, where the baby unconsciously feels like it's putting unwanted bits of itself into the mother.
Wow.
Or internal objects. Those mental images we carry around of our early caregivers, those became central.
And how did Klein connect this to gender and sexuality?
Well, Klein's seen as a kind of bridge to later relational thinking. She shifted the symbolic focus away from Freud's emphasis on the phallus and Oedipus. Towards really early infancy. The relationship with the mother's breast, for instance, became this hugely important symbol, like a metaphor for the sexual relationship itself, trying to get back that intense early connection.
Interesting. But what about the origin of sex and gender for Klein?
The source says she tended to root sex and gender in innate factors, constitutional dispositions.
Yeah.
Almost like an unconscious knowing of your own genitals from the start.
So still a kind of biological grounding for gender.
In a way, yeah. But the symbolism of sexuality was focused differently. And the source notes that these relational folks often contrasted their views with Freud's. They often framed Freud's view as too antisocial, too biological. They argued their theories better captured the idea that humans are fundamentally relational, needing connection right from birth.
Pushing back against the idea of the individual just driven by isolated instincts?
Exactly. Arguing that we seek out others from the get-go, not just as secondary outlets for drives.
Makes sense. You can really see the field starting to branch out, different emphasis, different developmental stages.
Definitely.
Okay, let's loop back to that really thorny issue. Freud ditching the seduction theory. This is where the criticism gets really sharp in our sources.
It really does. According to the perspective we have here, particularly from Florence Rush, Freud initially did seem to believe his patients when they described childhood sexual abuse.
Disturbing stories, often quite detailed.
Yeah. But then, around 1897, he made this dramatic U-turn.
And Rush's argument, as presented here, is that this wasn't just theoretical, it was personal.
Deeply personal, she suggests. Apparently, during his own self-analysis, Freud concluded he and his siblings showed signs of hysteria. Right. By his own theory at the time, that would mean they had been abused. And the source suggests this idea of abuse in his own family was just unthinkable for him.
So Rush speculated that
to protect his family, maybe unconsciously, he reinterpreted his patients' accounts, not as real events, but as fantasies, wish fulfillments.
Wow. That's a heavy accusation. That personal factors might have swayed a major theoretical shift.
It's a very serious claim highlighted in the sources. And Rush also argued Freud actively tried to avoid blaming fathers.
How so?
The sources point to the Dora case again, suggesting that while the published case seems to blame an uncle for an assault,
yes,
private letters apparently revealed the perpetrator was actually Dora's father. Rush saw this as part of a larger pattern of letting fathers off the hook.
So critics like Rush saw this whole shift away from the seduction theory as having really damaging real-world consequences.
Absolutely devastating in their view. Rush felt it basically normalized the idea that adults initiating kids into sex was just childish fantasy, not actual harm.
A huge setback then.
A massive setback from this perspective. For the early feminist movement, which was trying to validate women's experiences of abuse and for understanding trauma generally, hysteria in this light wasn't just some complex neurosis.
It was potentially PTSD.
It was often, they argue, a cover-up for the PTSD caused by real trauma. It reframes the whole thing.
Completely.
And this fits into Rush's wider argument that child sexual abuse isn't just about individuals doing bad things. It's a symptom of, like, institutionalized patriarchy, female powerlessness, baked into structures like the family that we often idealize.
Heavy stuff. And this connects to another complex Freudian idea mentioned, the repudiation of the feminine. What's that about?
Yeah, it's dense. The source suggests this concept, maybe along with his idea of psychic bisexuality, that we all have male and female elements, led to the feminine becoming kind of displaced in his theory.
Displaced how?
Like, it wasn't just synonymous with women or located only in women. One source connects this to observations about families where sons got more attention, more privilege than daughters. And the suggestion is that feminism, from this angle, emerged partly as the feminine, the actual experience of being female in that setup, resisted being sidelined or thwarted to benefit the masculine.
So the critique is that Freud's theories, perhaps influenced by his own biases, ended up reinforcing some societal inequalities and maybe overlooking the reality of female experience and trauma.
That's the core of the argument presented from this critical perspective in our sources. Powerful stuff.
Definitely. Okay, now let's actually go back to the Dora case itself. See how Freud applied his methods to understand symptoms and the unconscious. This is where, like you said, the rubber met the road.
Right, back to the clinic.
Yeah.
And Freud himself admitted getting a clear story from patients like Dora was really hard.
Why was that?
Well, people couldn't just recall things neatly. He talked about true amnesias, real memory gaps, even recent ones.
Okay.
And paramnesias, where the mind kind of fills in those gaps with plausible but not accurate secondary memories.
It's like patching holes. Sort of. Plus, what he called unconscious disingenuousness, not deliberate lying, but unconsciously twicting or holding back info, and just a general messiness with timelines. The analyst had to piece fragments together.
And his big idea about hysterical symptoms was overdetermination. What did that mean again?
Crucial concept. It means one symptom doesn't have just one cause. It's packed with multiple meaning.
Layers.
Layers. It represents several unconscious processes, all converging on that one symptom, like a knot tied with threads from different times and different conflicts.
And he also thought you needed a physical vulnerability.
Yeah, a somatic compliance. Some kind of bodily predisposition, maybe an organic issue or sensitivity, that allowed the psychological distress to express itself physically there in that particular spot. The body had to be ready to sort of speak the symptom.
Mind and body working together to create the symptom. Let's look at Dora's symptoms. Her intense disgust at Herké's kiss.
Right. Freud linked that powerful disgust. It wasn't constant, but was central to her story. He linked it to a repressed perception.
What perception? He theorized she might have felt Herké's erection during that kiss. And this was so repulsive it got instantly pushed out of awareness.
So the disgust was a defense.
Exactly. Guarding against that repressed memory and feeling popping back up.
Fascinating. What about her cough and losing her voice, the aphonia?
The sources connect that to unconscious ideas about her father's sexuality. He's a perceived impotence.
Impotence?
Yeah, the German phrase used, unvermögender man, apparently means both a man without financial means and a man who's sexually impotent. Freud tied this unconscious thought about her father to her throat and mouth, which were physically irritated areas for her.
Suggesting maybe unconscious links to other forms of sexual gratification involving the mouth?
That was his interpretation. The symptom knitted together her body's sensitivity with her complex feelings and thoughts about her father.
Wow. And her breathing difficulties. The nervous asthma.
He traced that back to childhood, overhearing things.
Like what?
Fragments of adults having sex. Detached fragments of the act of copulation, as the source puts it.
And she'd reproduce the symptom later.
Yeah, typically when her father was away. Expressing, Freud thought, a mix of longing for him, but also anxiety linked to that original scary, exciting, overheard scene. And the somatic compliance error, there might have been a real physical trigger, like getting out of breath from running, that then got hooked into this psychological meaning.
It really shows how tightly he saw mind and body linked in these conditions. What about her vaginal discharge, the leukorrhea?
Freud saw that physical symptom as pointing towards infantile masturbation
Okay.
and connected it to feelings of shame, disgust, a sense of her genitals being dirtied, which he thought was also a projection, a feeling about her own condition.
And it also connected to her father.
Yeah, to this idea that she had somehow inherited his evil passions, which Freud saw as masking a hidden self-blame beneath her conscious anger at others.
So even a physical symptom could represent really complex internal conflicts about guilt and inheritance. He also talked about symptomatic acts, didn't he?
Right.
Small unconscious behaviors.
Yes. Seemingly random little actions that he believed weren't random at all.
Like Dora playing with her handbag, her reticule.
Exactly. He thought actions like that expressed unconscious thoughts. The source connects the reticule like a little pouch symbolically to female genitals.
Oh, okay.
So her fiddling with it was seen as potentially hinting at masturbation, but also her fear that doctors might uncover her secrets, the discharge, maybe bedwetting, the masturbation itself.
Like the unconscious is always trying to peek through, even in tiny gestures.
That's the idea. And what about supervalent thoughts?
Right. These are conscious thoughts that are really intense, really resistant.
Yeah, and Freud often linked them to reactive reinforcement,
Meaning
meaning the very intensity of the conscious thought is doing a job. It's actively repressing its opposite in the unconscious.
so the strength is suspicious.
Kind of, like Dora's incredibly strong criticism of her father. While she genuinely felt it consciously, its intensity might signal that it was working hard to keep hidden some underlying, unacceptable positive or conflicting feelings towards him, or maybe self-reproach.
The conscious thought is like a guard dog for the unconscious feeling.
That's a good analogy. And you mentioned unconscious emotions earlier, specifically the homosexual feelings he later identified in Dora's case.
Yeah, towards Frau K, right, the wife of her father's lover.
This was a huge realization for Freud, apparently quite late in the analysis. He felt this powerful, hidden homosexual love for Frau K explained a lot.
Like why she was so angry at everyone else involved, but not Frau K.
Exactly. Her jealousy and vindictiveness spared Frau K. He believed he'd missed seeing how this powerful undercurrent was playing out in the transference in her feelings towards him.
Which adds yet another layer of complexity. Hidden feelings driving behavior. Okay, speaking of the analysis itself, let's talk about dreams and transference, and then connect this all to how we think about identity now.
Right. Dream interpretation was absolutely key for Freud. In Dora's case, he saw her dreams as complex wish fulfillments.
Not simple wishes, though.
No, intricate ones, weaving together current events with powerful childhood experiences and feelings.
Like the jewel case dream, that's a famous one.
Very famous, and interpreted symbolically on so many levels. The jewel case could stand for female genitals, or maybe mother figures.
Or gifts, sexual favors.
Potentially. And it also linked into themes of wetness, being dirtied, connecting back to the catarrh, the bedwetting, her feelings about her body. It tied a lot of threads together.
And the second dream, the one with the strange town, the letter, the station, the wood.
That one was full of what Freud interpreted as symbolic geography, representing female anatomy.
How so? Bahnhof.
The station. He linked to Vorhof, the vestibulum, the thick wood he saw as pubic hair. Nymphae, labia minora seen in the background.
And the meaning.
He read it as representing an unconscious striving towards female genitals, maybe driven by guilty curiosity from reading about sex or anatomy.
So the unconscious, using spatial metaphors for complex or forbidden sexual ideas.
That's how he saw it. And beyond dreams, maybe the most crucial concept for the process of psychoanalysis is transference.
Right. This is fundamental.
It's described as patients unconsciously taking feelings, impulses, fantasies from past relationships, especially early ones with parents, and redirecting them onto the analyst.
Like replaying old patterns.
Exactly. Freud called them new editions or facsimiles of the past. It's seen as totally inevitable in analysis.
And useful.
Incredibly useful, though tricky, because it brings all that hitter stuff right into the room. The patient's core issues start playing out live in the relationship with the analyst, where they can hopefully be understood and worked through.
But in Dora's case, Freud felt he didn't quite manage that. He didn't master the transference in time.
That was his own assessment, yes. He came to believe he hadn't fully grasped the depth of her unresolved homosexual feelings for Frau K as they were being transferred onto him.
And that affected the treatment.
He thought so. He felt Dora ended the analysis abruptly, not because she was better, but because she was acting out. acting out her unconscious feelings of revenge and abandonment, especially related to Frau K, instead of bringing those feelings into the analysis to understand them.
Ah, I see. So this brings us right back to the bigger picture. How do these old psychoanalytic ideas about the unconscious, drives, transference, symptoms, how do they connect with how we talk about gender and sexual identity today?
Well, one perspective from the sources is quite interesting. It suggests that psychoanalysis, precisely because it sees the sexual unconscious as so complex, so messy, so resistant to neat categories,
Yes.
it actually offers a way to understand the fluidity and provisionality of identities that we see discussed so much now.
Oh, so.
This idea that identity isn't fixed comes, in this view, from the ego constantly struggling to make sense of something deeply alien within itself, those unconscious sexual drives that don't just line up neatly with biology or social norms.
So from this psychoanalytic angle, trying to find one single, fixed, true identity, especially just based on sex or gender, that might be kind of a losing battle.
The sources suggest it might be an impossible endeavor, yeah. The unconscious just doesn't fit into tidy boxes. And trying to define identity only through, say, biology or observable behavior, the objective view, that's also seen as incomplete.
Why?
The sources say that just gives you another symbolic key, another framework for trying to grasp it, but it doesn't capture the whole subjective reality, the inner world, the personal history.
But does that mean trying to understand identity or fight for recognition is pointless?
No, not at all. Quite the opposite. The source actually says the emancipatory enterprise is meaningless, but it's full of meaning, not lacking it. The idea that having all these different perspectives, psychoanalytic, social, biological, personal, is what allows for nuanced translations. It helps us handle the ambivalence, the uncertainty. That's just part of being human and exploring who we are.
Okay. But the sources also raise concern about identity categories themselves, right?
I do. There's a warning that even well-meaning identity labels can sometimes become tools for control or medicalization, ways to define, manage, even pathologize people.
And social justice movements have pushed back against that.
Historically, yes. The sources mention the resistance, for instance, to research looking for the causes of being transgender.
Why the resistance?
Partly remembering how similar research into the causes of homosexuality was used to try and prevent or cure it, a fear of history repeating itself.
Learning from the past makes sense.
Exactly. But even with those cautions, the core psychoanalytic approach, despite all the critiques, still emphasizes asking why and how.
Directed at the individual.
Yes, not just slapping on a diagnostic label. Asking about the individual's unique story, their inner world, exploring all the complexity that escapes labels.
And where does feminism fit in this ongoing conversation? We heard the critiques, but that Reddit snippet suggested it's not purely rejection.
No, it's much more complex. Feminism's relationship with Freud and psychoanalysis has been really dynamic. Lots of critical engagement.
So using some ideas, challenging others?
Exactly. Many feminists have selectively used concepts like the unconscious or the idea of the divided self, while also pushing psychoanalytic theory in feminist directions. And the source points out, sometimes conflict arises just from misunderstanding the jargon.
Like terms meaning something specific within psychoanalysis that gets lost outside it?
Precisely. Terms like libido or the phallus often have specific symbolic meanings that aren't literal, and that can cause confusion.
So feminists have borrowed tools, reshaped them, critiqued them, developed them.
It's an ongoing dialogue,
Yeah.
which reflects how complex these subjects of gender, sexuality, the mind really are.
This has been, wow, a really deep dive. From Freud's controversial beginnings, through the critiques, the evolution of different schools.
Peering into the layers of the Dora case.
Yeah, the symptoms, dreams, transference, and then connecting it all to how we grapple with identity and fluidity today.
It definitely shows how these early, sometimes flawed ideas really did change the whole conversation about being human.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a lot to think about, especially that psychoanalytic idea of the unconscious resisting easy categories and the whole historical struggle around defining gender and sex. So here's a final thought for you to chew on, drawing from everything we've discussed. Given this long, complicated history of psychoanalytic thought wrestling with the fluidity and strangeness of the psyche, how does this deep dive into our internal worlds challenge, or maybe even inform, the ways our society today tries to define and categorize identity?